Hi everyone, real pleasure to be here again for a CAMHS Campfire session. Welcome everyone. Come up to the campfire, warm your cockles. It's a cold night here in Bristol. I hope you have fun for the next hour or so. We've got a great panel and we've got a really great topic. We're talking about hearing voices in young people. While Matt gets the slides ready, I've just got a little bit of an introduction to give. I'm Andre from the Mental Health. I'm an information scientist. I've worked in mental health research for the last 20 years. I'm not a clinician, so I've got a very broad knowledge. And hearing voices is something that personally really interests me. It's something that I think is really poorly understood. And there's very little research on it. And I guess the experience is very different for different people. So we've got a woman with lived experience, Rebecca Burns, who's here this evening. She's a member of the McPinn Foundation Young People's Network. Really looking forward to hearing her experiences and her views and her perspective on this issue. We've got a clinician here today, Dr. Emmanuelle Peters. She's a clinical academic psychologist at the Institute of Psychiatry. Hi, Emmanuelle. She's also the clinic director of PICkup, which is a brilliant acronym, the Psychological Interventions Clinic for Outpatients with Psychosis at the Maudsley. We've got a research perspective. We've got Dr. Sarah Parry here this evening. Hi, Sarah, who is the lead author on the paper that we're going to talk about. She's a clinical psychologist and a researcher. She works in the Northwest and was the principal research lead for the Young Voices study, co-authored this paper that we're going to look at this evening with Filippo Varese. And we've also got an ELF perspective, my colleague Douglas Badenoch, who's here this evening. Hi, Douglas. He's an information scientist like me, and he co-founded the National ELF Service with me. So we're going to spend the next hour or so. Do you want to put up the slides, Matt, and give us the agenda? Really, I guess, talking through this paper that was published a few weeks ago, Voice Hearing in Adolescence, looking at the question that Sarah tried to answer with this research, thinking about this evidence. Is it valid? What are the findings? And is it important? Is there anything we can do with it? Can we actually use it in some way in our practice, for other research, in our policy? So we're going to have a chat, but we're also going to do some critical appraisal. So a combination of looking at the research and thinking about the methodology, and then talking about the relevance of this. So just a bit of background. We don't know much about hearing voices. We know a little bit about the lifetime prevalence. A relatively recent review published in Holland shows us that children and adolescents have a prevalence of around about 12%. Lifetime prevalence of voice hearing. And that's a lot more than in adults. So they differ quite significantly from adults and older people. The prevalence is about 5%. So the experience of hearing voices is really common in young people. It's as common as having asthma, but we know remarkably little about it. So we're going to try and change that this evening a little. We're going to make a start. So I wanted to start, Rebecca, by asking you, it's always great to have a kind of lived experience perspective, first of all, to just kind of briefly introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your perspective, and yeah, why are you interested in coming to this session tonight?
Hey, I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Zoom is not normally my friend. So I'm Rebecca. As said, I'm from the McPinn Young People's Network, and I have heard voices for, I think it's coming up for 9 years now. And I've been under clinical services for 6 years and engaged with various peer support groups. I've helped mentor some younger people younger than me, and that comes across with a wide range of voices. And what particularly interested me, I think the topic in general is brilliant because, as you said, it's highly under-researched in under 18s. But obviously, young people's perceptions of themselves and how they relate to voices doesn't start forming at 18. It's not a blank void and then you hit at 18. Cultural forces can have a huge impact on how people view themselves. So to give you some examples from other people's lived experience that have given me permission to share, I've had people often underestimate how common it is, as you said, with the statistics. I don't think I've had a single group or a single person I've interacted with who hasn't at some point gone, I thought it was just me. That doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing or a loneliness thing, as we will see with some of the research, but it is that, and also it does affect how voices are used positively or negatively. I think an interesting example would come from my experience. I developed them at 15. I did not seek treatment until I was 18 and asked for mental health support based on the belief that I was dangerous. Now, if anybody's met me, I apologise to ants for standing on them and teddy bears for sitting on them and wolves for walking into them. I am not threatening. That didn't come from my realistic appraisal of myself or my abilities. That came from cultural factors. And I think more data in voices in young people would help with stigma, how people view themselves and how they relate to the world around them. And there are some really brilliant things about this particular study that we were going to talk about later, but that was what interested me about the topic generally and why I really wanted to be involved.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a really great introduction. So Emmanuel, over to you. I wanted to give you a space just to very briefly introduce people to voices. What does it mean to hear a voice that isn't there? And give us a bit of a picture of the kind of variety of experiences that people have and what we know about that.
Thank you, Andre. I guess I think the variety is the key point, really. When the diversity of experiences of people who hear voices is massive. And to me, that is the most important thing, to always, sorry, I've got things coming up on my screen, to always look at the person's perspective before making any assumptions about what the experience is all about. And the experience ranges from a one-off voice in particular circumstances of stress or things like bereavement, where it's very common, to extremely positive voices which give people's lives meaning and which are enriching, to extremely distressing voices that basically are and go on all day long, are relentless and tell you to do terrible things and talk about you in terrible ways and make you feel terrible. So there is such a spectrum of experience that is the most important thing. To not assume that it's an abnormal experience in the sense that it means it is an indicator of pathology, while at the same time not invalidating people's experiences that are very distressing by saying, well, it's a common thing, it's a normal thing, and you just need to learn to live with it. So I think that's for me, the diversity of experience and understanding the experience in a multidimensional way. So not just the fact that you're having a voice, but the meaning you attach to it, the relationship you have with it, the beliefs you have about it, how it impacts on your life, whether you feel you can control the experience or it controls you, how much you believe in the power of the voices, or what interpretation you have. Is it a spirit? Is it a past person come to protect you or come to haunt you? Or all of these multidimensionality are the crucial aspect of voices, rather than just, do you hear voices and that is a sign of pathology. And it's cross diagnosis and cross human experience as well. So I think for me, these are the crucial things about understanding voices.
That's great. Sarah, over to you. Tell us why you did this research and the question that you tried to answer.
Well, I suppose the original idea for the research actually came from work with adults who had started hearing voices when they were very young and essentially hadn't really felt as though they'd ever had that experience validated and really heard. Some didn't even feel as though they'd really been believed when they told people. So that was, I suppose, what led me to start reading up and trying to learn more about the experience. And I was just surprised at how little research had actually been done with children and young people, given that it's their experience. So I just wanted to really try and start a piece of work that had a go at least at asking the right questions, and as I'm very happy to discuss at some point this evening, we realised actually we hadn't asked all the questions that we should have done, and lots of our young participants helped us out by telling us the information that we should have asked about. So it was really just a start to hear directly from their experience what it was like for them, and what sense they'd made of it.
Great, thank you. And finally, Douglas, I want you to kind of give us the ELF perspective now, just briefly, because you've kind of looked at this. And maybe we can bring up the question for poll 2, Matt. We've already asked you guys on the webinar what your kind of primary roles are here this evening. For those of you who have read the paper or the blog, we wondered what your thoughts were on it, whether it had changed your perspective in any way. So tell us whether you strongly disagree or strongly agree. 10 means you strongly agree that it changed your perspective on voice hearing, reading about this paper or reading the blog. We're going to ask that question again at the end. So if you haven't read it, don't feel like you have to answer that now. And Douglas, you've read it. You've blogged about it. Yeah. First of all, kind of first impressions from you.
Yes. Well, the first impression for me was something trepidatious, because qualitative research is something I find a bit scary. I'm an information scientist like you. We read a lot of different types of research, and it's something that I feel is a little bit out of my comfort zone, if you like, in terms of an approach, the broad approach. That's not to say I don't value it at all, quite the reverse. I've seen plenty of qualitative studies and worked with qualitative researchers around capturing the diversity of experience. We've already heard the checklist of this is why we need qualitative research, is to understand not just about the typical outcome or experience, but to understand the diversity. And that gives us a lot more richness in, potentially richness in the research that we read, because it's, as you say, it's not just like a quantitative study saying, here's your answer with a confidence interval. It's allowing you to understand the landscape a lot better. And if done well, it gives us an insight into, in this case, the subjective experiences and how people manage them. So as I kind of worked my way into it, it kind of unfolded quite nicely, I felt, and had to do a bit of digging about the methods. But we can talk about that in a bit more detail. But as far as the research question goes, I felt that this was really quite an important and urgent topic, where there's probably a lot of people out there who are just under the radar, not telling anyone about it, trying to deal with this on their own. And that obviously has a lot of impacts when they eventually come in contact with professionals and how they manage it going forward. So it'll be very interesting to come back, Sarah, to your comment about all the other questions, because that's the other great thing about qualitative research is broadly, it helps us to understand in more detail what questions we should be asking.
So do please ask some questions if you're in the webinar and you have questions for any of the panelists or broader questions, stick them in the chat. We'll try and come to those later on. And let's put the slides back up, Matt, and let's go to slide 5. And let's get into the detail of this. Douglas is going to start off by presenting his appraisal of this paper and talking you through the methods and the results. And then we're going to get into some detail and ask Sarah to respond and Rebecca and Emmanuel to comment. So first of all, methods, Douglas.
Yeah, so on this slide, I've just kind of done a very brief summary taken out of the blog and obviously there's a lot more to it than that, and it would be good to hear from Sarah when we reflect on this section. But the key thing here for me was that the sample was recruited via social media, so people were kind of volunteering, but then we were using health trusts and support groups to reach out and try to contact the people that needed to take part. So I guess it means there's, we're not quite 100% sure exactly who the folk were who took part, or how they came to engage with it. But the second thing I want to make, I think, was particularly important about this study was the platform that the team developed to do the actual research, to engage online. And I think, and Sarah will fill in for us, but I think the idea here is that because this is a group that are hard to contact almost by definition, these are people who are uncomfortable talking to professionals or to their friends or family or perhaps anyone about their experiences. And so using the online platform, I think, is quite a nice and innovative way of doing that. The population that we're looking for was aged 13 to 18, but they didn't have to have an existing diagnosis or any contact with mental health services, although some of them did. So that was about the group of people. And then in terms of the data we got from filling in the questionnaire about their experiences, the other thing that really kind of triggered me off was looking at how you analyze that data. In this case, I think the approach that was used was, again, this was one that I hadn't come across, and it was called Foucauldian informed narrative analysis, which is again, that's one of these are the words that kind of frighten me. But once you look under the surface, you start to realize where we're going here, that this is a way of analyzing people's reports of their experiences that focuses on these sorts of power and control issues that we've already heard are some of the key concerns for people who hear voices. And that approach was then followed up with a phenomenological approach where the researchers are looking to understand how people make sense of their own experiences specifically. So it seems that this is a kind of almost a two-pronged approach that is able to deal with not just the experience of the experiences, the phenomenological aspects, but also how that relates to people's feelings of power and control. A final point I think was also very good was that throughout the process, the team involved folk with lived experience, and that included in the evaluation of the outcomes, and that's of the data at the end, which for me, that was a big strength of the study. Could we skip on, unless you want to stop there to reflect, Andre, we'll just skip on to the next slide, Matt.
Just quickly to say, yeah, I'm sure people are thinking of questions as we go along. So we're starting to see some of those in the chat. Do please post your questions in the chat, and we can look at those in a second. And also, Matt, maybe we could share the poll 3, which is asking people what they think of this method, whether they think this is valid as a way of doing research to answer this question. So tell us what you think. Is this a valid approach? These qualitative methods?
Yeah, the checklist we've got up there just shows the framework that I've used for appraising qualitative studies developed by CASP, the Critical Appraisal Skills Programme. CASP sort of breaks down the process into a checklist, and it's well worth looking up the CASP qualitative tool. Those are your Google search terms if you want to find it online, because it gives quite a detailed breakdown under each question of the sorts of things that you're looking for. And you can see it was mostly greens for me. I had a couple of questions around indicated by the amber areas around the recruitment strategy and the sort of reflexivity aspects of the narrative analysis approach, the Foucauldian approach. I think on reflection and having discussed this a little bit in more detail and learned a bit more about the Foucauldian approach, the reflexivity, i.e. how do the researchers' biases affect how they interpret the data that they're seeing, these aspects are kind of baked in to the sort of Foucauldian narrative approach. And I'm sure Sarah Cannon will give me a much better answer than that, explanation than that.
So let's open up the floor a little bit to Rebecca and to Emmanuel, first of all. I must admit, when I look at qualitative research and I read the paper, I don't read the methods in too much detail. I kind of skip over them and I look at the results and the conclusions. And then if I think, oh, these are good results, I'll go back to the methods and think, right, is this valid then? Is this a good way of answering the question? And it's interesting that the poll results show that over a quarter of the people in the webinar are unsure whether this is a valid approach or not. So hopefully towards the end, we can get a bit more certainty around that. But Rebecca, what did you think of this approach? Did you do the same thing that I do and just skip over the difficult sciencey bit?
So I am a little bit of a glutton for punishment, and when I don't understand that part, I'm going to keep Googling it and eventually send Sarah many emails about aspects of it. But I was actually particularly interested in the, and I'm only saying this the once, Foucauldian informed narrative analysis aspect, because we were looking at some of the language they were using and how the question statements were formulated and things. And yes, I thought it was brilliant because, as the study says, the medicalized language aspect is a really big part of lived experience. It was something I'd said to her earlier, in that I'd gone, that is something I've wanted to articulate for a very long time, but I did not have the psychological terminology for it. So I thought that was really brilliant. It was a really brilliant method as far as I understand it, and I'm not pretending to particularly understand it. But it was also really cool in terms of the link between power and language applies to the general things, but there's also the power dynamic between the individual and their voices. And that was something that I think that particular approach really did some interesting things with, because in terms of if the voice is based on past language experience, in terms of based on someone, your relationship to voices has changed, your relationship to that language might have changed. I hope that makes sense. But yes, and I think that was one of the few methodologies I could see in some of the other things that captured that really complicated aspect of how everything interferes in how your brain functions and how you think you're thinking. And when you get to the point where you're thinking about thinking, and then you just give up. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Great response. Sarah, do you want to come back on that and also answer for us one of the questions that's come up a few times already in the chat about consent? So how did you get around this issue of consent with teenagers in your research?
Yeah, so I'll just go back one more step, if that's all right, around consent in terms of why it was such an issue for this study. So as Rebecca's already mentioned, we know that actually most young people, for all sorts of reasons, may well not tell their parents, their siblings, their friends, or anybody about their experiences of voice hearing and other sensory experiences, sometimes for a very long time. And if we had a different approach, say if we were asking people only to come forward for interview and to provide their parent there as well, so that their parent could consent, that would mean that young person would have already had to have had that initial conversation with that parent about what their experiences were. So again, we would have silenced essentially that massive group of young people that don't feel comfortable talking about their experiences. And part of that is because of the stigma that surrounds experience. It's because of all of the social myths and so on that surround it. So again, by not including them in the research, in a way, we were perhaps just contributing to that kind of silencing, stigmatizing, very problematic approach. So we really felt it was absolutely essential that we tackled this head on. So we liaised with the ethics chair at the NSPCC. We spoke with our local NHS rec, that's the Research Ethics Committee. We requested to have our NHS ethics application reviewed by a research ethics committee that specialised in research with children and young people. And initially, because we were so worried that we needed to show that we were demonstrating that we were obtaining fully informed consent from everybody aged 13 to 18 who would have been able to complete the survey by themselves, assenting to take part. We'd put together actually initially quite a complicated comprehension task. We'd done lots of reading around linguistic abilities and cognitive kind of abilities at different ages, and had put together this kind of multiple choice comprehensive task that came in the form of a consent form after the information sheet, and the very sensible research ethics committee said that we'd probably made it far too complicated and to make it simpler, so we did. And so we had a simple comprehension task following the information sheet that acted as the consent form that then facilitated people going through to the online survey. So essentially 13 to 18-year-olds could take part without parental consent. We had the safety net of the amazing Voice Collective on hand, so that if any of the participants at any point needed to call or email Voice Collective, they could. We also had a number of crisis lines available on every page of the survey to make sure that that information was available. We had the information sheet available to read online, to download as a PDF, and we also had a verbal audio as well, to try and make sure that we had different ways of keep getting the information across. So I'm not saying what we did was the best it could have been. We've learned lots of lessons through this research, but we did feel it was safe and inclusive, and that we had sought advice and support from experts in that field.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move on, because otherwise we're not going to get to talk about the results and the implications and all that interesting stuff. So Emmanuel, I'll ask you to come in next, if that's okay, in response to the findings. Thank you. So yeah, Douglas, back to you. Let's get the slide up and tell us what we found with this research and what you thought about it.
Slide 8, please, Matt. And this kind of talks to one of the questions about how many participants had told people. One of the key findings for me was that half of the participants had not sought healthcare or community-based support. So that suggests quite clearly to me there could be quite a lot of folk who just aren't telling anyone. And I think that maybe chimes with what Rebecca was saying earlier about her experiences, and I guess people that you work with may have similar experiences. So that I guess that's quite an important thing to bear in mind, and that a lot of people will be carrying a lot of these with concerns without voicing them. Another striking thing for me was the balance between negative or upsetting and distressing experiences of voices, but also positive, and both mixed emotions. So there was quite a substantial number who got a lot of positive support and comfort from their voices. If we could jump to the next slide, please, Matt. I've just got a quick summary of those, and you really encourage people to go into the paper to get a little bit more detail here. But it was very interesting that not only that there were some people regarded their voices as helpful, and they gave them support, they gave them advice, companionship, all these sorts of things. But there was also important differences between positive and negative experiences in terms of how people understood them. And I thought that was quite an important thing, that it would be more difficult to unpack some of the issues with the negative voices than there would be with positive voices. So there's not a kind of one size fits all thing here. So for me, those were the key take homes. I think they'd probably be helpful at this point to give Sarah the opportunity to expand on that and what she felt were the expand on that in a bit more detail, and then go around the other members.
Yeah, please do, Sarah. And maybe, highlight what surprised you about this, or did this just confirm what you already knew?
No, we had loads of surprises, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so important to sometimes do research that can perhaps be perceived as a little woolly, perhaps a little too flexible, all the usual things that go along with qualitative research. But if you don't ask the open questions, you don't get the open answers, and then you don't find out the surprises. You're just trying to confirm your own hypotheses, which may be way off, or just exclude loads of different people. So we did have lots of surprises. We were really surprised how many of our participants were reporting these positive experiences. One of the biggest surprises for me was this sense of a reciprocal relationship between a child and a voice, especially when the voice had become quite personified, seemed to have a listening function, provided lots of things in terms of social functions that we'd normally be hearing about with younger children with imaginary companions. So that was a real surprise. We weren't expecting to hear so many accounts of that, and it was also well, probably best words, massively impressive, how many young people, like really young, like 14, 15, had essentially found ways to formulate their own experiences and tie lots and lots of different experiences together to develop really detailed, sophisticated, meaning-making processes around their experiences. And by the sounds of it, a lot of them had done that without any help. We all know young people are amazingly resilient, but it was really, really amazing how many young people had been, made progress down that path. So yeah, lots of surprises.
And any differences across gender?
Yes, so it was difficult to extrapolate lots of differences from this first analysis. We kept the survey open a bit longer just because we kept getting surges of participants now and again. So with the larger complete sample, when we eventually closed it, we found that girls were much more likely to report more distressing experiences and also more distress from those experiences. Many more young girls talking about very critical, very undermining voice content. Boys told us they had perhaps more multisensory experiences, so visions, felt presences. So there were gender differences. Girls, perhaps because they were having more distressing experiences on the whole, reported they were more likely to try and seek help from services, from family, from friends. So yeah, there are definitely some gender differences there that we'd like to learn more about.
Interesting. So Emmanuel, over to you. What's your kind of clinical perspective on this research? Did these findings surprise you?
Well, interestingly, they didn't surprise me so much, or at least the finding that there was lots of positive views of people's voices, and their voices brought benefits to the kids' lives. And that's part of my, I guess, from my research hat on with adults. I do a lot of work looking at healthy voice hearers. So I know that, in fact, for most people who hear voices, their voices are positive or at least not problematic. And of course, we know that although the prevalence is high in children, actually over 80% of those remit spontaneously anyway. So it's only a very small proportion that carry on. And I also know from the adult work in healthy voice hearers that, and that had surprised me when I first found this, and as have other groups, which is actually the healthy voice hearers tend to have an earlier onset of their voices than people who end up in clinical services. And of course, from the clinical standpoint, we always think that an early onset is bad news. It's going to lead to more severe problems later on down the lines. So it was interesting that actually starting hearing your voices young could potentially be one of the protective factors for later on. And the people that I was researching had voices for 30 years. And I guess one of the things which I think also fits with what some of the things that Rebecca was saying, was that if you are able somehow to make friends with your voices, or not be, to have your voices before you're aware of the stigma around voices and the fact that it may be a sign of pathology, or if people around you react to it in a positive way, then you're able to start to live with them as as part of normal human experience, as opposed to something that perhaps happens in sort of later adolescence or early 20s, where it's a break from previous functioning. If you've lived with voices all your life, and I'm talking about an age of onset around about 8 in some of the groups that we have seen. So the positive aspect of voices didn't surprise me. The gender actually aspect did surprise me, because in the psychosis world, of course, on the whole, women tend to do better than men, and they tend to have more protective factors like relationships and confidants and those sorts of aspects. So but not to, of course, invalidate the fact that over majorities, over half, 56%, did experience their voices negative, because we also know that in terms of those who present services, there was a really nice study done by Suzanne Jolly recently, and some of her colleagues in SLAM, South London Moseley NHS Trust. In fact, about half of people presenting to CAMHS hear voices. So we also know that they do come with some distress, and that people, or having interventions, it would be helpful. So, and for those who are distressed, starting to help people, learning how to integrate them in their lives, cope with them, destigmatize them, learn strategies, find ways to think about them in a way that's less distressing. And the earlier on you can do that, then the better.
I'm really interested in this phrase healthy voice hearers that you spoke about, and asking Sarah what the research showed in terms of whether we can kind of, categorize people in that way, whether it was just that I'm a healthy voice hearer, or whether people kind of fluctuate over time and sometimes they hear positive and sometimes it's negative and it's more of a mixture. Does the research tell us anything about that?
I think our research has showed that people can have very mixed and very nuanced experiences of their voices. So voices can be scary and very unpleasant, but also valuable and helpful in some way, in the same way that other human experiences like anxiety can be problematic in some ways and very useful and helpful in other ways. So I think the picture is quite complex. We obviously need to hear from many more young people to try and cast generalizations. But I think the issue for a lot of young people is not necessarily the presence of voices or the nature of voices. It's how other people make them think about the voices that they have. And really, it would be nice to get to a point where somebody can just hear voices, and for them not to have to be in a category, for them not to have to be called a healthy voice hearer, for them just to be somebody who hears voices.
Yeah, Rebecca, you're nodding there. What do you think needs to change for that to be the case in society, for us to just say, oh, you hear voices? Yeah.
So I think it's very much partly to do with some of the conclusions the research came to about pathologizing them. So there were two particular bits that I said to Sarah I thought were brilliant, and I think both Sarah and Emmanuel have really explained those. So presenting the array of voices is generally very good in showing that some can be positive. However, also, we know that not all voices go away. A significant proportion of them don't. And so CBT specifically for psychosis, or sort of other therapies that go with it, like ACT, might focus on accepting them. However, there's a fundamental difference between let's make this neutral. It doesn't really add or take anything from your life, but you've got to spend 6 months to a year learning this view, versus this brings something positive to your life in this way. So that is really useful. And it's also a really useful set of research to have in specifically areas like hospitals and that, where they might not have the same types of presentations that we see elsewhere. So they might not be used to potentially healthy voice hearers. I have been admitted with other conditions, depression, and yes, it was very much I walked in, they went, "Ah, yes, you hear voices, that's your issue." And I'm going, no, they are not great, but they are fine right now. They are behaving themselves. I'm actually here for something else. And then something I really liked about what Emmanuel said was talking about the fact that actually early onset can be a protective factor, because I'm sure the psychological mechanisms, but yes, you learn to cope, you learn to manage. But in terms of what you said about society, from a clinical perspective, something I'm very aware of in adult services, and I'm trying to think how most clearly to phrase this, is that in day-to-day, I would be encouraged to reframe my own reality. I have ownership of that. However, when I'm in crisis, I'm suggested to let somebody else tell me what is real and what isn't, because it de-escalates it. That is useful, but that can, and I've seen it in groups, people have talked about how that bleeds over into other areas. So then you go from voice hearing being a very small negative thing in crisis periods to affecting large periods of your life. And that's why I was particularly interested in the younger onset, because I think on the whole, it can be a really protective factor. But if clinicians present from a young age as, because of this condition, which of course not all voice hearers have this condition, I'm talking just clinically here, because of this, you need to doubt your judgment more, that could potentially negate some of the positive factors because they are doubting their judgment for longer. And so that was something I really liked about this research, when they specifically focused on the fact that you need to link development and clinical, because you can point out that the developmental stage of learning to take your own responsibility for your narrative. I've slightly lost my train of thought. I hope everybody's following me there. Yes, you need to know how important that stage is in order to ensure that you're not disrupting it. And I thought that was brilliant from the research and from what Emmanuel said. And that just comes across in a lot of lived experience people I've met. Sorry, that was a very long ramble, but I hope it made sense.
Crystal clear. Thank you. Yeah, and everyone's thumbs are up. Yeah, Emmanuel.
Can I just add, I think that's so fascinating what you said, Rebecca, which is, I think for a lot of clinicians, the psychotic experiences such as hearing voices trumps everything else in terms of that severe, depression, anxiety, that's common. And actually we find, I would say up to 50% of the people we see in our clinic, these are adults, but in pickup clinic, actually it's not necessarily the psychotic experiences, the voices or the visions or the other, so-called unusual experiences that are the core problems that people have. Actually, they can deal with those. It's the depression and the despair that they have at getting up every morning with no social valued roles or not having a meaningful relationship, and sometimes those issues are a lot more distressing than the voices where, well, I can just handle them and, sometimes they're a bit of a pain, but actually what I want to work on is this. And I think you should always engage with what is distressing for people, not necessarily what you think is normal in terms of, what we say is normal human experience. So I thought that was really, really fascinating and interesting to hear that's also been your experience.
Yeah. So I just want to poll everybody again. You're going to get poll fatigue, I'm sorry, but poll 4 is interesting because it asks whether this evidence is clinically important, these findings that we've discussed. And I wonder what people think of that. So tell us, in your experience as clinicians or whatever you guys are, do you think this is important clinically for people? And then we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the implications of this evidence. And we're going to ask Douglas just to reflect for a few minutes on that and then open it up again for discussion. We might go on a little bit past 6 o'clock because I think this is fascinating and we're all having fun. So I hope you are too. And yeah, so feel free to stick around for a few more minutes after 6 if the kids can hang on for their tea. 90%, there you go, Sarah. Stick that in your ref feedback. Bang on. Qualitative research. Pah. Douglas, implications. And can we have the slides back, Matt?
Thank you. Yes, there's only really one slide to show at the end, and I think we've kind of picked a lot of these up. I wanted to make sure we didn't lose the chance to pick up a few of the questions that folk have been posting in the chat. Particularly, there was a few questions around things like, was there any evidence of change over time in people's experiences of voice hearing? I think it'd be interesting to hear from you around that, Sarah, in a wee second. Around, are there important cultural issues in how people interpret and frame their experiences? So we'll come to that in a second. But one of the things that, again, it goes back to the how this study was approached. But one of the things that I took out of it was the comments from the participants on the effect of taking part in the study. So there's a couple of quotes here. "This survey helped me get my feelings out. Thank you for giving me a place to talk openly about my experiences." And I guess that made me think, well, what else can we do with this sort of platform? Yeah, does it lead to avenues for researching new questions? Is the participation in itself a helpful thing for young people? And maybe they're doing this through other platforms that obviously we don't have access to. And my last thought about the platform is there a potential here for generating a body of data that other researchers could consult? So, for example, you could capture people's experiences and then allow other researchers to look at them. Is there scope for that kind of facility? But I wanted to first pass back to Sarah to comment on the questions around cultural backgrounds, framing people's experiences. Are there any issues around changes over time?
Yeah, thank you. So we were really conscious that we wanted to ask questions from different angles. As a clinical psychologist, and those of us in health services, we tend to work with people who've got difficulties and problems and challenges that they haven't been able to solve themselves, often because they're very complicated, and you get very used to looking for problems and trying to find solutions. So actually, it seemed really important for this study to include, I love qualitative research. I discovered it during my doctorate and have loved it ever since. But it still seemed important to include some sort of screening and assessment tool as well, which is why we developed the Mavic that went before the qualitative questions in the survey, so that we did have a few yes and no answers. They're mostly like our scales because we expected things not to be particularly binary for most people. But we asked, if experiences could be frightening and scary. We also asked if they could be encouraging and supportive, and that was really interesting. And I wonder if asking those questions in that way made some of the qualitative questions maybe a little bit easier to think around, in that we were kind of building up knowledge of each young person through the survey. And it just when you're mentioning that there, Douglas, it genuinely made me feel really sad actually when I saw those comments that the survey had been a helpful place to talk. So I thought, gosh, if a research survey is this place, that's not okay. There's got to be better places for young people to be able to talk about their experiences. We tried to ask the questions in a narrative way to help that story building process, looking at each individual experience from a different perspective. But I think in terms of building a bank of experiences and different accounts, I think that could be such an important thing to do. Methodologically, I think it would be quite tricky, because I still don't think we've got a firm grip of all the questions that we need to ask and the ways in which we need to ask them pinned down. I'm also always very aware with qualitative research that there has to be a huge amount of very, very careful anonymisation before any quotes are shared. we were blown away by the depth and detail that so many young people went into on an online written survey, and incredibly grateful as well. I've missed a question, Douglas.
It's the one about ethnicity, I think, that's key, Sarah, is to tell us what the Black, Asian, minority ethnic, mix of your sample was.
Thank you, and I'm not actually sure I can remember it offhand. I could perhaps just very quickly.
Was it big enough to kind of draw any conclusions about how experiences are different in different groups?
No, and I think our sample was too small to perhaps draw those conclusions, and I'm very wary about doing that, particularly for unusual sensory experiences and equally around aspects relating to early onset psychosis, because there is evidence that there's overrepresentation from Black and ethnic minority groups in psychosis services, but actually there are so many issues with that in terms of conceptualization, how people can misperceive symptoms. So I think that's an area where there's a lot of very, very critical research that needs doing, because I think there are so many structural inequalities and biases in place. I would be very dubious about drawing inferences unless there were very robust, large samples to be looking at.
Yeah, fair enough. Of course, it's not ethnicity that makes people have a higher risk of things like psychosis. It's all sorts of other things that are going on. Yeah, Emmanuel?
Absolutely.
I was just going to say very briefly, because I'm mindful of the time, for people who are interested in cultural aspects of hearing voices, I really recommend the work of Tanya Lerman, who's an anthropologist and has written quite a few very fascinating books about that.
Great. Yes, thank you. Okay, so Rebecca, I wanted to kind of come back to you and ask what you thought of these implications that Douglas has presented and the way that Sarah's responded there. Any kind of final thoughts?
Sorry, I was having a moment with the mute button there. So I think what was particularly I think the implications were brilliant, and I liked, as I said, the range of things. But what was particularly interesting was actually watching the chat in response to that, in that you could watch people reevaluating certain aspects, and they're going, oh, well, how does this and this doesn't work here? And I think that's particularly important in terms of how it affects clinicians, because again, as I've said repeatedly, and I'm trying not to sound like a broken record, one of the most harmful things, and it's understandable when you have many patients and a short thing, is to categorize too quickly. And that is also an issue in, I think we use healthy voice hearers, or just people who view them as positive. They might not view themselves as healthy, but that doesn't mean that they feel they fit that category. And that is, I apologize, I've just lost my train of thought. Could we possibly go to somebody else, please?
Sure, thank you, Rebecca. I just very quickly wanted to, we're kind of winding up, I think, and some people have to head off. I would like to hear Sarah's thoughts about all the questions that she didn't want to ask. And as you were saying, Rebecca, there's a lot of questions flying in the comments field, which would probably need an entire, I hope the NIHR are watching this, because we can commission quite a lot of studies on the back of the unanswered questions that come out of this research. But I wondered if you could put the poll number 5 up, please, Matt. So this is asking the same question that we asked at the start around, has this paper changed your perspective on voice hearing? And this will give us an idea by doing a bit of a before and after. Does having the journal club, how does it affect, very crude terms, what people think about it?
And while people are doing that, thanks, Douglas, for stepping in, because my Wi-Fi flaked away there for a second, so my chairing was impossible. But I wanted to also ask Emmanuel to kind of give us a couple of minutes at the end here in response to quite a few of the questions that have come through about what do we do in response. If I'm working in a school, how can I best support students. You know, we know from this research that a lot of young people don't necessarily talk to their parents about this, or haven't disclosed their voice hearing to their parents. What advice would you give to people who work with young people if they find out that this is an issue?
Well, of course, Sarah is also a clinical psychologist, so I'm sure she can also answer that. I think first and foremost is to not panic, not overreact, not catastrophize. The first thing is just to acknowledge and probe a little bit more, I guess, about whether this is actually a difficulty for them. And sometimes just saying, you know, this happens to us all under stress, perhaps finding out whether this is in the context of a bereavement, and so really just not overreacting, immediately thinking this is a sign of long-term pathology and potentially a precursor to psychosis. That's the most important thing. For those who are distressed, of course, then you can give them little coping strategies. Sometimes, you know, it's for just having a little bit more control over the voice. So, you know, you could have very simple coping strategies, such as kind of humming to yourself if you just wanted the voice to go away for a little bit. Listen to music with headphones, just to distract yourself from the voice if you just wanted to get a bit of peace from them. Sometimes just having a bit of like a worry period with the voice, so that rather than the voice coming in, so at times you don't want them, you could try. This doesn't always work, I have to say, but you could try and have a little deal with them, saying, you know, I'll listen to you later. I'm kind of busy right now. Not overreacting to them, not getting into a fight with them, and getting really sort of emotionally involved. But when people are really quite distressed, especially if it's occurring in the context of lots of other stuff happening, then that's when perhaps asking help from mental health professionals might be the answer. Sarah, you also may want to add to that. I know that you work clinically.
I think you've covered loads there, but I think the key things are to be the calm one, to keep the calm, you know, to try and soothe the young person, and also just to remember how many skills, you know, people have. We've just done some research with teachers and social workers, because we know that young people are very likely to confide in teachers, especially. That's come up from our research. And there are so many transferable skills: listening, conversations, having existing relationships. You know, remember your own skills as well when a young person comes to you and tells you that perhaps they hear voices and they're frightened by them. So I think there's lots to do, and all of the usual grounding exercises that you would do to help somebody find their calm again will always be helpful.
And I think it's really important. I mean, Rebecca also talked about reality-based explanations. I think sometimes it's not helpful to try and invalidate people's realities. So if you go too strong down, this isn't real, and you know, you mustn't, you know, you just, you know, it's not true. Actually, that invalidates people's realities. Well, for some people, actually, if you're, what you might need to put across is that these are not dangerous. So actually, the voices might say they're going to do terrible things. They won't manage. They might tell you that you're a horrible person. It's not true. They can just be like bullies. That doesn't mean that what the bullies say about you is true. It's the bully's problem. It's not your problem. So I think listening first to what's happening with the person. For some people, just to say it's just a voice. It's not actually really happening, and they can't do anything. So don't worry. It might be very good for other people. But I think going too far down, you know, this is all in your head, and that means you might be going mad, would be the implication. It can be very unhelpful.
So I think it's that the voice is real, and the voice is real to the young person, but it's what they're saying doesn't necessarily need to be true or real.
Rebecca, do you want to come in?
Yes, that just really resonated with me, with a point I was thinking about earlier, in terms that something that helped with me and with other people is that we've gone, okay, you hear your voices. In my case, they are very negative, but the reason I attribute meaning to them even when I'm well, so even a day like today, I can hear them. I attribute the meaning because I believe what they are saying, not due to their inherent authority, but because I already believed it. And I saw a comment about that on the chat. But it's worth putting it in the context. It's worth putting it in the context of why are they doing that? And it was what they're saying, you don't necessarily need to invalidate the reality. They are there. You don't have to believe them. They don't necessarily have to be any accurate. And I think there's some brilliant stuff about calming and things. Just for there are a few people on the chat who are sort of talking peer-to-peer relationships, depending on who you have that relationship with. This sounds very flippant, but one of the best reactions I had was I explained to a friend that I heard voices. Very first hospitalization, had told no one, first friend, and her response was, "Oh, is that all?" And then she went, "Sorry, that was meant to be really invalidating." She panicked, but it was that unimportant to her friendship with me. And it is very much something that continues with things like, "I'm really struggling, voice is getting bad." She's going, "Do you think they're hungry? If I get them a Kit Kat, would that work?" Now, do not take that as a general approach, but it is brilliant sometimes to engage with them, but not imbue them with power, I think is my overall point. Even if you're putting them as a form of reality, it doesn't mean they are any more of a persuasive or correct form of reality than anything else.
We've only done 2 of these CAMHS around the campfire, but I'm absolutely loving them. And this has been a really interesting discussion. It's been great because we've looked at a research paper, but actually we've ended up just talking about the experience, what it's like for people, what we can do to help people. And there's loads of uncertainty. When we first started talking to Sarah about this, that was the first thing she said. There's so much that we don't know here. But it's been a really constructive conversation. So I wanted to thank ACAM for hosting it, and to Sarah and Rebecca and Emmanuel for being on the panel, and for Douglas for writing the blog, to Steph for keeping us all in order and keeping the chat going and answering questions as we've gone along. There's one final poll. Tell us what you think of this. We're doing these monthly, these CAMHS around the campfires. And so next month, we're going to have another session at the end of the month. And I've completely forgotten what it's about or who's going to be in it, but we'll be tweeting it to CAMHS Campfire very soon. Sarah?
Hi, Andre. I just noticed there are a few comments in the chat just about raising awareness and resources. We've developed some resources from our research with young people and Voice Collective that are freely available to use, download on the Young Voices Study webpage. So please feel free to use those as helpful.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks also to the McPinn Foundation, Young People's Network. Rebecca's representing them tonight. They've been fantastic in helping us organise these and connect us up with great young people who can share their experiences. So yeah, I'm going to draw it to a close there. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone, and good evening.
To be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health, visit www.acamh.org.